He called himself the Sun King, built the most magnificent palace in the world, ruled France for 72 years and made it the envy of Europe. But Louis XIV had a secret that would absolutely shock you. The man who claimed divine right to rule was absolutely terrified of water. Picture this. You're looking at Versailles in all its golden glory. Mirrors everywhere. Chandeliers worth more than entire kingdoms. Nobles fighting wars just to watch the king get dressed. This is the ultimate symbol of power and sophistication, right? Yet behind those gilded doors was a reality so disgusting it would make you gag. While nobles fought for the honor of watching him dress, they had no idea they were witnessing one of history's most elaborate hygiene deceptions. The Sun King, the man who controlled the fate of millions, was slowly dying from his own cleaning routine, and he was taking his entire kingdom down with him. This wasn't just about one dirty king. This was about how ignorance at the highest levels of power can create a national health crisis that lasts for generations. In an age where water was considered deadly poison, even the Sun King couldn't escape the curse of 17th century medicine. But what makes this story truly terrifying is how Louis turned his personal disasters into royal law. When you're the king of Europe's richest nation, your personal habits become everyone else's gospel, even the toxic ones. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about royal cleanliness. We're talking about a palace with 10,000 people and only 3 toilets. A king who poisoned himself daily and thought it was sophisticated. Medical treatments that were slowly killing him while he believed they were keeping him healthy. And the final twist? His fear of getting sick is exactly what killed him. The gangrene that consumed his leg in 1715 wasn't just a random disease. It was the inevitable result of 72 years of hygiene practices so wrong, so backwards, that they turned the human body into a breeding ground for infection. This is the story of how fear, power, and dangerous pseudoscience combined to create one of history's most disgusting royal scandals. Shocking hygiene secrets that the court of Versailles desperately tried to hide from the world. Secrets that prove wealth and power mean nothing when you're fundamentally wrong about basic human health. Let's start with the most famous lie in royal history. You've probably heard that Louis XIV only bathed 3 times in his entire life. Most people think this is just medieval myth-making designed to make ancient royalty look primitive. But historians have been hiding the truth for centuries. It wasn't a myth at all. And the reason why will make you question everything you thought you knew about 17th century medicine. The man who called himself the Sun King, ruler of the richest nation on earth, genuinely believed that water could kill him, and the medical establishment of his time completely agreed. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't laziness. This was science. 17th century science that was dead wrong. Imagine living in an age where the greatest medical minds in Europe, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris, have officially declared that people who bathe frequently are most likely to catch the plague, where water isn't seen as cleansing, but as a gateway for death itself to enter your body through your pores. Louis XIV had watched the Black Death devastate Europe for generations. Entire cities wiped out, families destroyed overnight, and every medical expert told him the same thing. Your Majesty, those who expose themselves to water are inviting disease into their bodies. The theory was called miasma, the belief that disease came from poisonous air, from invisible toxins that could seep into your body when your pores were opened by warm water. To Louis and his doctors, taking a bath wasn't about getting clean. It was about making yourself vulnerable to the very forces that had killed millions across Europe. So the Sun King made a conscious decision. He would avoid water at all costs. But those 3 legendary baths, they actually happened, and each one tells us something shocking about the psychology of absolute power. Bath number 1, the royal birth ceremony, 1638. When Louis was born, he was given the traditional royal bathing ceremony. This wasn't about hygiene, it was about politics and religion. The infant prince was bathed in water blessed by bishops, with specific herbs that were supposed to give him divine protection. Even as a baby, Louis was being programmed to believe that water was dangerous unless it was made safe through religious ritual. Bath number 2, the wedding obligation, 1660. When Louis married Maria Theresa of Spain, Spanish court protocol demanded that the groom bathe before the ceremony. This wasn't a French custom. It was a foreign requirement that Louis absolutely despised. Court records show that he complained bitterly about this barbaric Spanish tradition and spent weeks trying to find diplomatic ways around it. In the end, political necessity forced him into the tub. But witnesses reported something chilling. The most powerful man in Europe shook with terror the entire time. He genuinely believed this bath could kill him. Bath number 3, the medical emergency, 1680s. By his 40s, Louis was suffering from chronic, debilitating headaches that left him unable to perform his royal duties. His personal physician, Guy Crescent Fagan, had tried every treatment known to 17th century medicine, bloodletting, herbal remedies, even prayer sessions. Nothing worked. Finally, in desperation, Fagan made a radical suggestion, a medicinal bath with specific healing herbs. Louis was terrified. He believed this could be his death sentence, but the headaches had become so severe that he was willing to risk death for relief. The bath was conducted like a military operation. Multiple doctors stood by with antidotes. Priests performed blessings. Court physicians monitored his pulse every few minutes. Louis reportedly trembled through the entire procedure, convinced he was about to die. It worked. The headaches subsided. But instead of learning that water could be beneficial, Louis drew a completely different conclusion. Water was so powerful and dangerous that it could only be used in the most extreme medical emergencies, under strict supervision, with extensive religious and medical precautions. So what did the Sun King do instead of bathing? He developed the most elaborate and toxic cleaning routine in royal history. Every morning, servants would spend over an hour rubbing his entire body with cloths soaked in wine and perfumed powders. Wine was considered safer than water because alcohol was believed to kill the poisonous vapors that caused disease. But Louis didn't know those perfumed powders contained lead, mercury, and arsenic, the deadliest toxins available in 17th century cosmetics. Louis also changed his linen shirts 3 times daily. In the 17th century, this was considered extraordinarily clean. The theory was that fine linen absorbed toxins and impurities from the skin, essentially cleaning the body without the dangerous exposure that came with water. Wealthy families across Europe spent fortunes on linen specifically for this purpose. The irony is staggering. While Louis feared that water would poison him, his cleaning routine was slowly destroying his body in ways far worse than any bath ever could. The wine treatments were flooding his system with alcohol through skin absorption. The toxic powders were accumulating in his organs. The constant rubbing without proper cleansing created perfect breeding conditions for infections. But the most shocking part isn't what Louis did to himself. It's how his personal paranoia became national policy. French nobility across the country began copying his routine. Avoiding baths became a sign of sophistication and royal loyalty. Wine treatments became the new standard. An entire generation of French aristocrats grew up believing that water was the enemy of health and that poisoning yourself with heavy metals was the height of cleanliness. The Sun King had accidentally created a hygiene crisis that would plague France for generations. But if you think avoiding baths was bad, wait until you see what happened when 10,000 people needed to answer nature's call. What you're about to discover about Versailles will destroy every romantic notion you've ever had about palace life. Because behind all that gold and marble was a sanitation nightmare so extreme, it makes medieval castles look hygienic. Versailles had 700 rooms, £1,200 fireplaces, and mirrors worth a king's ransom. But it had only 3 actual toilets, for a court of 10,000 people. Let that sink in. The most luxurious palace on earth had 1 toilet facility for every 3,300 people. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't poor planning. This was the inevitable result of building a monument to divine power while completely ignoring basic human biology. The mathematical horror. Only Louis, the Queen, and the Dauphin had real toilets. And even these weren't properly installed until decades after Versailles was built. For everyone else, there were roughly 300 chamber pots scattered throughout the palace, portable, movable, and completely inadequate for the thousands of courtiers, servants, and visitors who lived there. But those 300 chamber pots weren't just for the 10,000 permanent residents. Versailles regularly hosted another 5,000 visitors for balls, ceremonies, and diplomatic events. On busy days, you're talking about 15,000 people competing for 300 places to relieve themselves. The result was predictable and horrifying. For the 99.97% of people at Versailles who weren't royalty, there were no flushing toilets, no plumbing, no designated bathroom areas, just chamber pots, buckets, and whatever corner they could find when nature called urgently. And the shocking truth that palace tour guides never mention. People regularly defecated in the palace stairwells, behind tapestries, in corners of the Hall of Mirrors, and basically anywhere they could find a moment of privacy. This wasn't occasional accidents. This was daily reality. Louis XIV had to issue official royal decrees ordering servants to clean human waste from the hallways every single week. Think about that. The Sun King had to make it royal law to clean poop from his palace corridors because it was happening so frequently. The cleanup operation was its own nightmare. The job of removing all this waste fell to 20 workers called gong farmers, who labored through the night, carrying buckets of human excrement through dark hallways and narrow staircases, trying not to spill as they transported the filth to open trenches outside the palace walls. Imagine being a foreign ambassador, arriving at the most magnificent palace in the world, only to step in human waste in the hallway. It happened constantly. Visiting diplomats wrote shocked letters home, describing having to navigate around obstacles on their way to meet with French nobility. To cover up this sanitation catastrophe, the palace burned massive amounts of herbs like lavender, rosemary, and sweet marjoram. Servants sprinkled flower petals on the floors and laid down straw soaked in oils to try to absorb the odors. But these coverings weren't cleaned regularly. Food scraps, hair, dirt, and worse built up underneath, creating hidden layers of rotting filth beneath the beautiful surface. Even Louis couldn't escape the stench he had created. The famous orange trees that tourists admire today weren't decorative choices. They were strategic odor control. Those potted citrus plants were placed throughout the palace specifically to mask the smell of human waste with their strong, sweet fragrance. But the most telling detail: Louis moved his court from palace to palace not for political reasons, but to escape the accumulated smell. Marly, Fontainebleau, Compiègne. These weren't royal residences. They were escape pods from the sanitation disaster at Versailles. The longer the court stayed in one place, the worse the waste problem became. No amount of perfume, no quantity of orange trees, no army of night soil workers could keep up with 10,000 people producing waste in a building with no proper sanitation infrastructure. And the most prestigious position at court, it wasn't Minister of War or Foreign Affairs. It was the groom of the stool, literally the man whose job was cleaning the king's toilet. This wasn't some lowly servant position. This was one of the most coveted roles in the French government, held by trusted nobles who had direct access to the king during his most vulnerable moments. Consider that reality. In the most powerful court in Europe, proximity to royal excrement was considered the ultimate privilege. The Sun King had created a golden prison where even he couldn't escape the stench of his own power. But the palace-wide sanitation crisis was just the beginning. Every single morning, something even more twisted was happening in the royal bedroom. What I'm about to show you is the most bizarre daily ritual in royal history. A ceremony so disgusting that foreign ambassadors were traumatized by what they witnessed. Yet 100 of the most powerful nobles in France fought wars just to be there. Every morning at 8:30 a.m., the most powerful nobles in France would gather for the greatest show on earth, watching their king wake up. But what they witnessed wasn't majesty. It was a carefully choreographed performance to hide a disgusting reality. Welcome to the lever, the most twisted daily ritual in royal history. Imagine this scene. You're standing in the royal bedroom at Versailles, gold everywhere, priceless tapestries, the most magnificent bed in Europe, and packed into this sacred space are 100 of the most influential people in France, pushing and shoving for position like animals. Why? Because who got to hand Louis his shirt could literally determine the fate of nations. The hierarchy worked like this. There were 7 different ranks of nobles, each with specific dressing privileges that had been codified into royal law. The Grand Chamberlain could hand over the royal robe. The Premier Gentilhomme could present the coat. Lower-ranked dukes had to stand and watch, seething with jealousy over who got to touch the king's underwear. But while they were fighting over the honor of dressing their king, they were actually witnessing one of history's most disgusting cover-ups. Because Louis XIV never washed his face, ever. The Sun King believed that water could damage his royal complexion. So instead, every morning his servants would perform that elaborate wine and powder routine. But now you're seeing it from the noble's perspective. Remember those toxic treatments? Well, imagine watching them happen while believing you're witnessing the pinnacle of sophistication. For over an hour, 100 of France's most powerful people would stand there, breathing in the fumes of alcohol and lead-based cosmetics, thinking they were witnessing divine hygiene. The Duke of Saint-Simon, one of the most honest chroniclers of Versailles, wrote in his secret memoirs about the horrible smells that emanated from the king during these ceremonies. But speaking about the king's hygiene was literally treason, punishable by exile or worse. And Louis had turned his vulnerability into power. By forcing the most powerful people in France to witness his most private moments, he made them complicit in his secrets. They couldn't mock what they had personally participated in. They couldn't question what they had been honored to witness. But the psychological manipulation went even deeper. Courtiers were actually taught that the king's body was blessed by God, that even its odors were divine. This wasn't just royal propaganda. This was religious doctrine designed to make physical revulsion feel like spiritual failing. Can you imagine the mental gymnastics required? Standing in a room, trying not to gag from the smell, while simultaneously convincing yourself that what you're smelling is holy. The English ambassador wrote detailed reports back to London about the unbearable atmosphere of these morning ceremonies. German princesses described having to breathe through perfumed handkerchiefs just to survive the king's dressing ritual. But the French nobles, they had been so thoroughly brainwashed that many genuinely believed they were witnessing perfection. And Louis used the lever to conduct actual government business. Ministers would schedule important meetings during the king's dressing ceremony because it was when he was most relaxed and receptive to new ideas. Envision this. Life or death decisions about war and peace being made while the King of France is having his unwashed body rubbed down with toxic wine in front of 100 people. Treaties signed while courtiers try not to vomit from the smell. The fate of Europe decided in a room that reeked of human decay disguised with flowers. But the most disturbing part wasn't what happened in that bedroom. It was what happened when those 100 nobles left and went back to their own estates. Because when you've spent years convinced that avoiding water and using wine as soap is sophisticated, what do you think happens when you go home? You start doing it yourself. You teach it to your children. You spread the infection. The lever wasn't just a morning routine. It was a daily masterclass in how to make an entire aristocratic class complicit in national self-destruction. Every single morning, for 72 years, Louis XIV programmed the most influential people in France to believe that hygiene meant poisoning yourself with alcohol and covering the smell with perfume. And it worked perfectly. But all of this daily theater was nothing compared to what those toxic treatments were actually doing to Louis's body. While he was teaching France's elite to poison themselves, his own body was becoming a medical horror show. What I'm about to reveal is so disturbing that court doctors kept it secret for decades. By his 50s, the Sun King wasn't just avoiding water, he was slowly decomposing while still alive. By his 50s, Louis XIV was slowly dying from his own hygiene routine. And his doctors, the best medical minds in France, were making it worse with every single treatment. This is the story of how the Sun King's body became a walking advertisement for everything wrong with 17th century medicine. Those daily alcohol treatments were systematically destroying him. For decades, Louis had wine rubbed directly into his skin for over an hour every morning. Alcohol absorption through skin is slow but relentless. Day after day, year after year, Louis was essentially giving himself a controlled poisoning that his liver couldn't process fast enough. The result? Chronic gout that started in his 20s and became absolutely crippling by middle age. But the vicious cycle, the more pain Louis felt from gout, the more wine treatments he demanded. He genuinely believed the alcohol was helping because it temporarily numbed the pain. What he didn't realize was that the alcohol was causing the very inflammation he was trying to treat. It gets worse. Those perfumed powders weren't just covering up smells. They were systematically destroying his organs. Lead, mercury, and arsenic accumulated in his body like a slow-acting time bomb. Every single day, for 72 years, the Sun King was having heavy metals rubbed into his skin. The visible effects were horrifying, but Louis had turned even his medical disasters into royal theatre. In 1674, he developed a massive neck abscess, a swollen, infected lump the size of a tennis ball. The court surgeon had to cut it open in front of the entire court because even medical procedures had become political spectacle. Can you imagine the scene? Pus streaming down the king's chest while he remained seated on his throne, refusing to show weakness, while hundreds of nobles watched and pretended this was normal royal routine. But perhaps the most disgusting and telling medical episode was the anal fistula of 1686. Years of the hygiene habits we've been discussing, combined with constant horseback riding, had created a painful tear that refused to heal. For months, the King of France couldn't sit properly. He had to conduct court business while lying on his side. And the irony, that would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. The one time Louis allowed extensive cleaning around his body was to treat an infection caused by not cleaning. The operation became the most famous royal medical procedure in European history. Charles-François Félix de Tassy had to cut into the king's body while hundreds of courtiers watched. No anesthesia, no privacy, just raw surgery performed as public spectacle, with the recovery involving daily bandages soaked in, you guessed it, more wine. As Louis aged, his body became a living catalogue of every toxic substance his hygiene routine had introduced. By his 60s, he suffered from chronic digestive problems, mysterious fainting spells, and recurring fevers. His teeth, rotted by years of lead exposure, became so painful that he could barely eat solid food. His breath was so foul that courtiers learned to stand upwind during conversations. Then came August 1715 and the beginning of the end. After a hunting trip, Louis complained of pain in his left leg. What started as a small dark spot near his ankle quickly became something far more sinister. Within days, the mark had grown larger and darker. Within a week, it had started to smell. The royal physicians tried everything: more wine treatments, bloodletting, herbal poultices, even prayer sessions. But the dark patch kept spreading up his leg, and the smell kept getting worse. Modern medical experts believe Louis was suffering from diabetes-related gangrene, made infinitely worse by decades of alcohol-based treatments that had compromised his circulation and immune system. Week by week, the rot crawled up his leg. Black, necrotic tissue that reeked of death spread from his foot to his calf to his thigh. The King of France was decomposing while still alive, and his court could do nothing but watch in horror while pretending things were normal. By late August, the smell had become so overwhelming that even those brainwashed courtiers could barely enter the royal chambers. The same nobles who had spent decades watching Louis get rubbed with wine were now witnessing the final consequences of those treatments. On September 1st, 1715, at 8:15 in the morning, 4 days before his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died in agony. The autopsy revealed a body so saturated with toxins that the embalmers couldn't preserve it properly. The Sun King, who had feared water would poison him, had been killed by 72 years of treatments designed to keep him clean. But the real tragedy wasn't just Louis's death, it was what he had done to France. Because this story isn't just about one king's medical disasters. This is about how one man's ignorance infected an entire civilization. What happened next proves that when you're the ruler of Europe's richest nation, even your worst habits become trends that can destroy countries. The final revelation will show you how Louis XIV's fear of water helped create the conditions for the French Revolution itself. When you rule the richest kingdom in Europe, your personal habits become everyone else's gospel, even the toxic ones. Louis XIV didn't just destroy his own body with dangerous treatments. He infected an entire civilization with deadly practices that lasted for generations. The moment Louis established wine treatments as royal protocol, French nobility across the country stopped bathing to copy their king. Rich families hired servants specifically to perform daily wine rub-downs on their children. What had started as one king's paranoia became an aristocratic epidemic. The French perfume industry exploded as everyone tried to mask their odors like Louis. Wealthy families spent fortunes on increasingly elaborate scents, pomanders, and aromatic oils. An entire economy built around covering up the smell of a nation that had forgotten how to wash. But while French courts reeked of wine and perfume, other European royals were quietly continuing to bathe regularly. The international reputation was devastating. Princess Lieselotte, a German princess who married into the French court, wrote horrified letters home, describing the hygiene disasters she witnessed daily. "The French believe that water is dangerous to the body," she wrote, "and so they poison themselves with wine and call it cleanliness." The cultural divide became a source of international mockery. French cleanliness became a sarcastic term used across Europe to describe anything disgusting disguised as sophistication. But the most damaging consequence: an entire generation of French children grew up believing that bathing was dangerous and that toxic treatments were healthy. The health consequences were catastrophic. French court gatherings became breeding grounds for infections. Nobles who copied Louis's habits died younger than their European counterparts. Meanwhile, in England, Germany, and other European courts, regular bathing continued quietly. These countries watched in amazement as France, the most powerful nation in Europe, descended into a self-imposed hygiene crisis that was killing its ruling class. But perhaps the most tragic consequence was how this disaster contributed to the conditions that would eventually destroy the French monarchy itself. While nobles rotted in perfumed luxury, spending fortunes on wine treatments and aromatic cover-ups, ordinary French citizens began to see the moral decay for what it was. The aristocracy's visible decline into toxic habits became a symbol of what was wrong with the old regime. When the French Revolution finally came, the revolutionaries' emphasis on cleanliness and virtue was partly a direct reaction to the royal court's decades of disgusting excess. The guillotine wasn't just about political revolution. It was about cutting away a ruling class that had poisoned itself with its own arrogance. Louis XIV's hygiene habits had contributed to the very conditions that would eventually destroy the monarchy forever. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he infected it. His fear of water became a national epidemic that lasted for generations and helped destroy the very monarchy he spent 72 years trying to perfect. But the most chilling lesson from the Sun King's story: wealth and power couldn't protect him from the consequences of being fundamentally wrong about basic human health. Louis XIV proves that when authority figures embrace dangerous pseudoscience, the damage spreads far beyond their personal choices. An entire civilization can be poisoned by one person's ignorance when that person has enough influence to make their delusions into law. The Sun King spent 72 years trying to prove he was more than human, divine, untouchable, immune to the basic needs that governed ordinary people. He created elaborate rituals to hide his vulnerability, turned his private habits into state policy, and convinced thousands of people that his toxic routines were sophisticated and holy. But in the end, his very human body proved him wrong. The man who claimed divine right to rule died decomposing from the inside out, killed by the very treatments he believed would preserve his royal image. Perhaps the most tragic irony is that Louis could have prevented his own suffering with something as simple as soap and water. The solution to his disasters was literally the thing he feared most. But Louis wasn't just a victim of his own ignorance. He was a carrier of dangerous ideas who infected everyone around him with his paranoia. French nobility died younger, suffered more diseases, and became international laughingstocks because one man was too proud and too afraid to admit he might be wrong about water. The next time someone in power tells you to ignore basic science in favor of their personal theories, remember this: even the Sun King eventually set. And when he did, he took half of France down with him.